The rain came on gray and cold, pattering with hard, metallic fingers at the panes of Mrs. Cobb's parlor. Drips spilled from Lizzie to the floor, the only other sound in the room. Turner looked back and forth between Mrs. Cobb and Lizzie, both of whom seemed about as surprised at each other as a new hope drying at last here. Mrs. Cobb breathed heavily, and her hands throttled the chair arms. Turner wondered if this would be the moment he would hear Mrs. Cobb's last words. "This is Lizzie Griven, Mrs. Cobb." "I know who she is. I know who her daddy was, and his daddy before him." "You do?" "Of course I do, and don't be rude. You with all your questions." Lizzie smirked at Turner. "This is Mrs. Cobb," he said. Lizzie said nothing at all as the metallic fingers of the rain pattered about as hard as they could without breaking the glass. Turner figured that if there was ever a time for a hymn, this was it. So he sat down at the organ and wheezed the air into it. He thought for a moment of the Battle Hymn of the Republic, but decided it wasn't a good idea to invoke the military. And so he set into "Shall We Gather at the River" as the most peaceful hymn he knew, even if it was about the afterlife. But Mrs. Cobb seemed not to be interested in the river that flows by the throne of God. "A Negro girl in my very house," she said again after the first refrain. Turner played through all 4 verses, with the refrain every time, and when he came to the last verse, he sang the words out loud. "Soon our happy hearts will quiver with the melody of peace," and finished with a harmonized Amen. He lifted his fingers and let the last wafting air carry the notes out into the room. When he turned around, Lizzie was sitting on the floor, her legs tucked up beneath her. Mrs. Cobb was still throttling the arms of her chair, but she was leaning back now and not breathing so heavily. "Turner," Mrs. Cobb said, "don't ruin the music by singing." Lizzie's eyes fairly danced. Turner figured she would have said the same thing had she thought of it first. "I thought you might not know all the words, it being the 4th verse." "Since I was singing that hymn before your father was born, it's likely I would. Try something snappier." So Turner pumped again and set into the battle hymn, and then into a couple of missionary hymns written to hold the attention of lost drunkards. They were pretty catchy. And a temperance hymn with a kind of rollick to it. Then he settled down into hymns that liked a trembling vibrato. All the while, he did not look behind him, but felt Mrs. Cobb and Lizzie holding their breath. When he finished, "I have some friends before me gone," he turned around and saw that Mrs. Cobb's hands had finally relaxed. She had folded them together and settled them high up on her lap. Her head was tilted back on the chair, and though her eyes were not closed, she certainly wasn't looking at anything in the room. And Lizzie Bright was smiling the kind of smile that showed that happiness had settled in somewhere deep and was glad to be there.